Hello, music makers. Well, this is a bit of a niche video. I was chatting to an old music friend of mine, and he confessed even though we first bought our Fireface 800s back in 2004, he's never understood the Totalmix software. And then, of course, because Google is always listening, this old Whitesea video pops up in my feed. In it, he teases a possible Totalmix tutorial, and the video is full of upvoted comments asking for that very thing. Yet, as far as I can tell, Whitesea never did that tutorial. So I did a poll, and it turns out there are still plenty of confused RME users out there. So, let's go. So having a look around YouTube, it seems that most Totalmix tutorials come from the traditional band recording or engineering angle, including RME's own manual. So I'm going to try and approach it more from the bedroom producer of electronic music type perspective. Also, I should be able to keep this pretty simple, as these days I only use the little Babyface Pro. So even though the software is the same across all models, this little fella has a lot less inputs and outputs to confuse us, so there's not too many channels to keep track of on screen. Now, let me say this first off. As many of you have probably already discovered, you don't even need to touch Totalmix if you're just going to use it as a playback interface. If all you want is a high-quality output from your PC, phone, or tablet, then you can just use the volume on your RME itself. But if you want to do any recording, or maybe route some sounds, or combine sounds, or loop sounds back into the input, or indeed troubleshoot any weird behavior, then it helps to understand what's going on. So here's what my Totalmix looks like. So with Totalmix, in a nutshell, what we're looking at is 3 rows. The top row is for inputs. That's anything you've got literally physically plugged in to the inputs of the device. And likewise, the bottom row is outputs. Anything you physically got plugged in to the outputs of your device. Headphones, speakers, etc. That's all taken care of on the bottom row. The middle row there is for software playback. So any software that's outputting some kind of sound, in my case Ableton, or even YouTube via my web browser, Spotify, literally anything making sound, that is dealt with on the middle row. If yours doesn't have 3 rows, you probably have 2-row mode turned on in the settings. I don't recommend you have that turned on if you're trying to learn the software. So let's go through each of the rows in a little more detail with some scenarios. I'm going to start with the middle row, the software playback. For most people just making music in software and not actually recording any live instruments, we can skip that top row. I'll explain that later. So this middle row is essentially what your operating system sees. So be it Windows, macOS, Android, whatever. The software you're using, this is what it sees as its output options. So for example, in Ableton here, the number of different outputs that Ableton can route to is 6. 6 stereo outputs here. That's the same as this middle row here, 6. So for example, imagine I wanted to use an external DJ mixer, but instead of CDJs, I want the tracks to come from Ableton. So for that, I can send one track to outputs 1 and 2, and then the second track to outputs 3 and 4. Now, instead of everything coming out of the master as one stereo output, each track now has its own output. Then if I bring those into the external mixer, I can use the EQs, the crossfader, etc., just as if the tracks were coming from any other source. Now, as expected, if you go to Totalmix, in the middle row, you can see this channel is being sent to 1 and 2, but the track on this channel is going to 3 and 4. That's pretty logical so far. But the next part is where many people get confused. For you see, these are just software playback channels. Even though our software sees them as outputs, remember this middle row is not physical outputs. That's the bottom row. So the sound has left our software, but it still hasn't left any physical outputs on the device yet. Because the whole point of Totalmix is to be this fully flexible mixer where anything can be routed to anywhere else, RME have separated software outputs from the physical outputs. In fact, the more old school amongst you might want to think of this as like the perfect patch bay. So when our software sends any sounds to outputs 1 and 2, it doesn't send the sounds to physical outputs 1 and 2. It's only sending it to this middle layer, software playback 1 and 2. So it's slightly less straightforward for us, but it does have lots of advantages, especially in live scenarios. Most of that stuff we won't ever have to bother with. But it should all make sense when we look at outputs next. So looking at the bottom row now, the physical outputs, there's not too much to explain here. If you want to hear sound coming out of that output, then you need to turn it up. It's pretty much as simple as that. For example, connected to this physical output is my speakers, so this fader controls the volume of those. And connected to this physical output are my headphones, so that fader controls those. However, of course, we still need to know what's being sent to those outputs. And this is where both the magic and the confusion of Totalmix lies. Many people get confused by the relationship of the faders in the first two rows with the outputs. First of all, know that the faders you can see in the top two rows, those are just one of many. We can only see one fader at a time, but behind the scenes, there's actually one fader for every possible output. So because my babyface has 6 outputs, we're actually looking at one fader of 6. If you notice, below every fader is actually its output destination. So we could just select that here, but there's an easier way. This is the most important button on this interface, submix. As long as that is lit up, then whichever output you have highlighted, i.e. the one in the lighter color, that will then show you all of the fader positions sending to that output. Now, if you don't see this on the side of your Totalmix, go to Window and untick Hide Control Strip. So to continue with our earlier example, we need to get 2 separate channels from my software into our DJ mixer. Now, in my case, physical outputs 1 and 2 are already connected to my speakers, and physical outputs 3 and 4 are already sent to my headphones. Let's just pretend, for the sake of this example, that I don't want to unplug my speakers and headphones just to connect this mixer. Instead, let's use some of the spare outputs. Over here on the left, I do have these 8 other outputs free. Well, 4 stereo channels. Now, on my babyface, those are digital outputs, but just go with the example for now. So to do that, all I have to do is highlight the output I want. In this case, let's go with digital 1 and 2. Then all of the faders above will now show me the positions of everything that's sent to that output. Currently, nothing. So let's turn up software playback channels 1 and 2. That will be our first track in Ableton. And then to get the other track out of Ableton, I highlight digital outputs 3 and 4. As we can see, nothing is currently being sent to those. So we send the software playback channels 3 and 4 to our outputs, digital 3 and 4. Now we've got everything sent where we need it to be. We just have to turn up those physical outputs. Sorted. So our DJ mixer is now physically receiving 2 separate channels. Okay, so to take this example even further, let's make things more complicated for ourselves. Imagine if I wanted to take those 2 separate outputs from Ableton and feed them into my headphones. Yes, I know normally you would have the headphones plugged into the DJ mixer, but just go with this example. Again, all I have to do is highlight the headphone output, physical analog outputs 3 and 4 in my case, and then send software playback channels 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 to my headphones. And while we're here, why not have it so I can hear my microphone through my headphones too? I have a mic plugged into input channel 1, so while my headphones output is highlighted, I can turn that up as well. So now I have those 2 outputs from Ableton and my microphone all going to my headphones. Then we have those 2 outputs from Ableton separately going to an external output, our digital output. So at a glance, whatever output I highlight, I can see in the top 2 rows which things are being sent to it. Does that make sense? Hopefully so. Right, seeing as I've mentioned microphone on the input, let's talk about the top row now, the inputs. So for my Babyface Pro here, the inputs 1 and 2 are on the back. This red lead plugged into input 1 here, that's my microphone. And as you can see, when I speak into the microphone, channel 1 is showing some level. Testing, 1, 2. By the way, I have turned off stereo on my inputs 1 and 2 here, so I have 2 separate mono channels for 1 and 2 instead of the combined stereo. Just in case you're wondering why mine might look different to yours. Anyone recording a single microphone might want to do this as well. Then on the Babyface, there's 2 jacks on the side here. Those are inputs 3 and 4. So we have 2 channels on the top row where those come in. I plug my guitar into input 3 usually, and then the rest of these channels are for the digital inputs, which are on the other side of the interface. I usually don't need to bother with those. In fact, you can hide them in the settings if you want. Now, I think the first thing that confuses many people is the faders here on this top row. I think some would assume because this top row is inputs, that fader would be the input level. But that is not the case. In Totalmix, faders always set the output of the channel, not the input. Instead, we set the input level on the device itself. You'll either have a physical input gain knob, or on the Babyface, I can do it like this. Or we can do it in Totalmix if we click this spanner icon here. Here is our input gain. So you'll see, even though the fader on this channel 1 is down on my Totalmix, if I go into my software and try to record what is coming into channel 1, Because I've turned my input gain up, you'll see my voice is coming in and getting recorded. So what's the point of the fader, you might ask? As I showed earlier, that's in case you want to send the input straight to one of the outputs. I used this fader to send to my headphones earlier. If you've ever heard of a thing called zero latency monitoring, this is how we do it on RME. Let me quickly explain that. When recording my vocal into some software, like Ableton in my case, if I listen to the output of Ableton, there's going to be a slight delay, because your recording software is going to take some time to process the sound. Especially in the case of using effects, compression, limiting, effects can add even more processing time, therefore resulting in more delay. Anyway, we don't want that, because trying to record your vocals or any other sound whilst there's a delayed copy being echoed back is extremely distracting. That's called latency, or anyone from the video game world might describe it as lag. So instead of listening to the output of our software, in Totalmix we just send the input straight to one of the outputs that we're monitoring, like my headphones, and that way there's no delay. Okay, so that's all the main things covered. Let's go over some of the more niche settings you might find useful. Have you ever tried to record a vocal, but on playback the voice is only coming from the left? I bet you've seen a few YouTube videos where this has happened too. Here's why. Many people don't know how to set up mono channels or mono inputs in their software. So if you just leave things as is and try to record a voiceover, you'll find the voice only comes out of the left, because your mic is only coming into one channel of a stereo input, and your software is using a stereo output. However, in Totalmix, if you split the input into two mono channels, you get the ability to pan them. So even if you do record onto a stereo channel, the voice will at least be in the middle. Oh, and while we're speaking about microphones, if you have the type of microphone which requires phantom power, then that's this button here, 48 volts. Have you ever wanted to sample or record the audio from another piece of software, like a game, or maybe online, like YouTube or SoundCloud, for example? With Totalmix, we can do that. If you open up one of the output faders, this is an option, Loopback. That lets us loop back any sound going to an output into an input without connecting any cables up. So, for example, if I wanted to record some of this SoundCloud track, first of all, let me just set up my web browser so it's not going to my main output. That way it won't get mixed up with the output of Ableton. There we can see it's playing back on 5 and 6 now. Then if I enable Loopback on one of these digital outputs I'm not using, I can send that software playback to this output. Turn that output up. Then if I enable that as an input on my Ableton here, we should hear that song coming through. There we go. That's available to record now. In the bottom right here under the Assign button, you can assign permanent outputs for your speakers and headphones. That's why my analog 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 appear on the bottom right here. Here you could also assign a second main output in case you've got a second set of speakers you want to switch between. The reason you might want to do this is because any outputs which are assigned will all obey the dimming and the mono switch, and if you wish they can also have their levels linked, so multiple speaker setups can be controlled with one volume control. Also, if you do have two sets of speakers assigned this way, you can set up a button to swap between them in the ARC window. By the way, if you have any customizable buttons on your interface, this is where you set what they do. I have mine set to mono check and dim. And for the last top tip, in the settings you can disable double-clicking on faders. This can prevent you deafening yourself by accidentally double-clicking near the master fader, sending your speakers to full volume. Now you have everything set up how you like, don't forget to store it in one of these mix snapshots here. Right then, I'm hoping that's cleared up most of your confusions. If not, get typing down below. However, if this did help, don't forget to return the favor, press some buttons for me. There's also a link down below to buy me a coffee if you're feeling so generous. And until next week, I will see you in the comments. Bye-bye.